I'm Doug Northcook, and I am a professor at Chatham University in Pittsburgh, where I teach design theory in the architecture department. And I'm also one half of DecoderVR. My other half is sitting right there. And we just released our first VR game on Steam on Friday. It's called Forestry. It's an open world deforestation game that's built on procedural destruction and construction. I'll talk briefly about one of our mechanics in here, but what I want to talk about today is kind of looking at human-centered design theory, specifically looking at Don Norman. I don't know, is anybody here familiar with Don Norman? Got a couple Norman hands, okay. So Don Norman is kind of the godfather of industrial design and human-centered design theory. So I kind of want to look at his 7 basic principles for design, talk about some current VR games and experiences that I think kind of understand his way of thinking about design in an interesting way, and then also look at how we should try to also ignore everything that Norman says at the same time to create experiences that don't try to strive for realism, but try to strive for something that feels real. So I kind of try to think about this in terms of VR versus IRL. So in real life versus VR. And I love to think about this this quote from C.S. Lewis, and I'm really bad at exact quotes. But when C.S. Lewis was asked about his fictional world in the Chronicles of Narnia, he would often say that it was actually real to him, that there was no difference between his world and Narnia, that Narnia existed for him just as much as the real world did. And yeah, virtual reality is, it's a piece of technology, but it does exist in our world. It is not a separate world. It is a part of the actual world that we live in. So we're going to go in, I'm going to go through quickly Norman's 7 design principles. We'll kind of talk about each of those a little bit and then dig into some specific experiences. So the first is discoverability. So it is possible to determine what actions are possible and the current state of the device. So the idea with discoverability is that any object, any item, anything, any environment is discoverable. So there is no hidden nature to the object. There is no hidden nature that is indecipherable to the user. So everything can be kind of quickly and immediately discovered by the user. The next is feedback. Full and continuous information about the results of actions in the current state of the product or service. After an action has been executed, it is easy to determine the new state. So in VR for us, we talk about audio. Audio is a really great way to handle feedback. Haptics are a really great way to handle feedback. Vision and effects are a really great way to handle feedback. Then we look at a conceptual model. So the actual concept of the world and the construction, all the information needed to create a good conceptual model of the system leads to an understanding and a feeling of control. The next is affordances. And if you haven't spent time around Norman or people who are obsessed with Norman and design theory, you might not know this word. So affordances is, the proper affordances exist to make the desired actions possible. So an affordance is everything that an object affords. So every possible action that can be done with an object. So we were having this conversation earlier about bottles and caps. And if I see a bottle and I see a cap, I expect that I should be able to twist that cap off or pop that cap off. The cap affords being pulled off, and the bottle affords being opened. Then we talk about signifiers, and signifiers are what signal to us the affordances of an object. So if you have a twist-off cap, and if you look at the cap on a bottle, you see the twist-off cap, and it has little arrows on the side of the cap that tell you that it can be twisted. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about signifiers. Talking about if something is not immediately obvious, you have to add in a piece of signaling information in order to make it obvious and clear. We talk about mappings. The relationship between controls and their actions. And for this is really clear and really easy. This is just how do we interact with things with controllers. And this is kind of like a perfect correlation between Norman and VR, is that With room scale VR, you have these controllers, you have all these devices that you have to interface with and create mappings for. And then also constraints, so providing physical, logical, semantic, and cultural constraints, guides actions, and eases interpretation. And I think this is where kind of the divide starts to happen, where what happens now is that, there are a lot of virtual reality experiences that stay very much within the constraints of traditional design theory and want to design things that feel realistic, and they play to the constraints of the real world. One of the most clear examples of this for me in general design theory is the QWERTY keyboard. The QWERTY keyboard is an incredibly flawed and awful design built for a specific constraint, which was typewriters jamming when people would type too fast. So they spread out the keys for inefficiency. We no longer have typewriters that we're doing work on, but we still use this incredibly inefficient method. And now you see people creating virtual reality experiences and bringing QWERTY keyboards into a virtual environment and continuing to bring in these constraints that are not part of what we can do or even should do. So I kind of want to put an example to each one of these and kind of talk through some of them. So some of these you might have seen, some of them you might not. But to talk about discoverability, so every object has kind of this immediate, you pick it up and there are different things that you can discover about it that are immediately clear. How many of you have played Justin Roiland's Accounting from Squanch Tendo? A few hands. So this is probably my favorite virtual reality experience, like in the last year. It's a free experience on Steam. If you haven't played it, you should, because it's completely ludicrous, but it's incredibly well designed. So you go through a series of vignettes, and in one of the vignettes, you're inside of a stomach, and you have this bottle of royal stomach acid, because you're inside of the stomach of the king. And once you have the acid, you can pour the acid onto these skulls, and the skulls will start doing different things, and then you can pour it all over, and then I won't give away what you have to do with the acid to get out of this room. But their whole game is built on discovery. You're constantly having to discover different uses for these objects that are always apparent, but it takes some time and it takes some discovery on the part of the user. So talking about feedback. So this is still from our game, from Forestry. And we spent a lot of time playing around with different mechanics and different ways of thinking about how to interact with objects. And Mike, who is the technical director on our game, had this great idea that instead of having to always go around and reach down to pick up objects, we wanted to introduce a telekinesis mechanic. So Mike prototyped several different versions of this telekinesis. A couple where you would, point your hand at an object, press a button, and then the object would just magnet right to your hand. And we thought that was fun. That was fine. That was all well and good. That's a useful tool. But what Mike decided to do, and this is like one of my favorite things to do in VR right now, is to make a skill-based telekinesis mechanic. So what happens is wherever you initialize the mechanic, so you point your hand at an object, you press in the grip button to initialize the mechanic, and then you get this orb down here. So you see this white orb, and then there's an emissive particle that comes out. So you activate it, it creates this orb, and then whatever direction you move your hand, it will exert force on the object in the direction that you moved your hand, and also force equal to the distance that you move your hand away from that orb. So what that allows you to do is not just have this simple mechanic that doesn't have a need, like a telekinesis mechanic that just magnets to your hand has no need for feedback because there is no control mechanism. It's just a click and you get it. But with this, what we realized we could do is I basically became Magneto in the forest. So I could chop down a tree, and then while the tree is falling, I could use telekinesis and float it in the air, and then I could slowly pull it to myself, and then I could rotate it around, and then I could even take another axe off and throw axes at the tree while I'm using telekinesis on it and cut it into more pieces, and then those pieces fall, and then I can levitate those pieces up and pull them. And after you spend a few minutes in it, because of the feedback, because there's this visual element, you're able to kind of get the sensation, and you're able to kind of latch on to a new intuition related to this mechanic. Where I've seen people that, they spend about a half an hour in the game, and then they're using telekinesis to pull items from their periphery without even looking, because they internalize the feedback, they internalize the mechanic, and they're able to they know where an object is over here, they point their hand, they use telekinesis, and they pull and they catch it, all without even looking at the object. So, conceptual model. So, trying to create a space that, especially in VR, I think this is really important, a space that has a really strong sense of concept, and that concept, you force the user to internalize it. So if any of you have played Superhot, their conceptual model is that time only moves when you move. That's the entire game. That's it. That's the entire model. It's the entire gameplay, and the user has to do it. And what happens is you are forced immediately to step in and take on this conceptual model as your conceptual model for how the world works. So, because if you don't, you can't play Superhot effectively. If you're constantly moving, enemies are constantly coming at you and you don't have enough time. So what happens is everybody has a different way of interacting with the model, but most people will basically end up doing Tai Chi, where they're moving really slowly like this, and then these really quick movements to punch an enemy, to grab a gun. And I think this is one of the most effective examples, because they're taking a concept like time, which in our world is at least seemingly fixed most of the time, and they're taking that and they're forcing you to reevaluate the way that you interact with time in a really effective way, and that's their entire game. Affordances and signifiers. Job Simulator, I think, is the epic affordance and signifiers simulator. And again, we were talking about this earlier in relation to a bottle and a cap, that if I see a bottle that has a screw-off cap in VR, and I pick up that bottle and I can't screw off that cap, I'm going to be furious. But the great thing about Job Simulator, and what they've done, and what Alchemy Labs has done an incredible job of doing, is everything affords everything that it can do. So the staplers staple, the copier copies. You pick up the bottle of wine and you can pull out the cork, and then you can drink the wine, and then you can break the bottle. And this is why people love Job Simulator, and why they've gotten so many awards, why they get great press, and why this is a game that, even though I've played through every piece of it, I keep coming back to and back to, because I love drinking bottles of wine and then throwing them at robots, because it's fun and it's hilarious, but it's fun and hilarious because it's so well designed. They're really thinking about this. They're really thinking about every single object. Like, I can pick up a donut and then I can eat the donut, and then I can eat the other half of the donut. I can fill up my coffee mug with coffee and then I can dump it out. That there is no object in Job Simulator that you can't do exactly what you think you should be able to do with it, but it also doesn't strive to be realistic, because there's nothing necessarily realistic about Job Simulator, but it feels so real because everything is so well designed. So mappings, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges currently with VR, is that everyone is still really trying to figure out how to handle controls, how to handle UI, how to handle menus, inventory. And if you've played Vanishing Realms has what I think is the most genius inventory system currently, where when you find, if you haven't played Vanishing Realms, it's a kind of Zelda style. It's a dungeon crawler. You're going through, you're discovering new weapons and tools, and then all of your weapons are in a tool belt kind of around you down here. So if you see there, you see a bow and arrow, you see a spot to put a sword, and you can see all, health and mana and gold, but you also have items. So the first time that I played it, I didn't go through any sort of tutorial. I found the sword, and then I found another item, and then I saw my sword was down in my belt, and then I could just reach down and pick it up. I could reach down and grab the bow and pick it up, and then I found an apple sitting on a counter, and I was like, I wonder if I can put that apple in my tool belt. It's like, grab the apple, put it in my belt, and then later I got hit by an enemy. I reached down, I grabbed the apple, I ate the apple, and my health was restored. And then I encountered an enemy in a part of the dungeon, and I realized that the enemy had his shield. It was this skeleton. He had a shield on one side and a sword, and I realized that because of the hands that I had my sword and shield in, that I couldn't get past his shield. And then what I realized is I could just swap the controllers, because I was using the Vive controllers, and I just switched hands, and then I was like, oh my God. I didn't even think about it. I just did it. I just immediately realized that I can just switch these items because there was no mapping that required me to keep a specific item in a specific hand. And then constraints. So I think constraints can go one of two ways. You can, and VR right now, a lot of games that work really well play to the constraints of users, of the technology. And I Expect You to Die does this incredibly well by basically making you sit down everywhere that you go, which is great because it works great on PSVR. It works great seated on Oculus. It also works great room scale. It doesn't really matter what piece of hardware you're on, but they didn't create a game and then constrain it. They built a game around a single constraint, which is you are in these really specific, closed, isolated environments solving these really fun, engaging puzzles. So you don't feel like you're constrained because the game is built for this constraint. In the same way that Superhot is built around a conceptual model of manipulating time, I Expect You to Die is built around this one specific constraint of keeping you in these very confined, escape room-esque spaces. So, from all of that, I mean, so talking about all these different experiences, none of those 7 experiences are trying to be realistic. None of them. They all illustrate these standard design practices, and they all have these really special pieces of them, but what runs them all together is that none of them are striving to be realistic. What they're striving for is this, and I was talking with a friend of mine. He was like, are you going to use this word in your talk? And I was like, I don't know, man. That's a really long word. So verisimilitude is a philosophical concept that is the appearance of being true or real. Truth-likeness. And I think this is the single most important design idea for virtual reality right now, is that we have this opportunity to create experiences, to create spaces that are not this. They are not this. So if I'm going to learn something in virtual reality, should I be put into a virtual theater sitting watching a virtual lecture? That's striving for realism. That's taking something from the real world, trying to duplicate it, instead of thinking about what is a completely different and unique way that we could think about doing this, not to create things that are realistic, but to create things that feel real. So I want to talk about a few ways that I think that thinking about virtual reality design to design for verisimilitude versus designing for realism, and how we can kind of think about that to engage users. So the first is the appearance of truthfulness. And this is a very vague idea, and I think this takes on a lot of forms, but like something like Superhot, which is a very low poly, very unrealistic looking world where everything is white and all the enemies are red and all the items are black. It's this very pared down, but what it does is it creates the opportunity for consistency, for presence, and because it's not striving for realism, you don't expect anything to act realistically. And if any of you have used some games or experiences that are really trying for this photorealistic effect, what happens is your immersion just constantly breaks and breaks and breaks and breaks because you can't make this in VR right now, and you won't be able to for a really long time. And my argument is that that shouldn't even be the goal. The goal of VR is not necessarily realism. The goal is to create something different. And the way that we do that is by suspending the user's reality. So again, a lot of the experiences that we walk through, what they do is they introduce these concepts and these ideas that feel familiar and feel intuitive, but they are completely divorced from reality. So, you know, in this world, I can't use telekinesis. I can't teleport. You know, more than half the VR games right now use a teleportation mechanic to navigate you around the world. You can't actually teleport, but once you internalize that mechanic, you just do it instinctively once you're in the game. You know, like playing raw data, I just keep a teleporter behind me and I keep a gun in front of me and I'm just doing this around the world. And then, you know, and this is an experience that I see a lot with playtesting, is people take the headset off, and I actually see people take the headset off after spending, you know, about an hour inside of an experience with teleportation, and I see them raise their hand. I see them raise their hand to try to teleport across the room. This happens all the time, and I still do it myself. I feel my arm want to come up, and I'm gazing where I want to go, and then I realize that I can't. The first time that I ever tried virtual reality, I tried Tilt Brush. Well, not virtual reality, but the first time I tried room scale VR, I tried Tilt Brush. Mike had pre-ordered a Vive. We waited on his porch all day for UPS to show up. We unpacked it immediately, set it up. Mike took a long run, and then I hopped into Tilt Brush for probably 2 hours and just sat down on the floor and just built a little city and a mountainscape and a river. And then the next morning, I woke up and I could not figure out what these were. I just like couldn't do it. I was just sitting on the edge of my bed and I felt like I was just like hallucinating and that I was just like high off my ass. And what I realized is that I was like, these are useless. And I just like couldn't shake it. I was just like, these don't emit light, and I don't have just like a palette of tools, and I was having like, I felt like I was losing my mind. And that was kind of the moment for me where I was like, I need to never do anything other than try to do this. And by this, I mean work in this space and try to do these things, because it was this moment where I was like, the design of this thing, and yeah, and Tilt Brush is amazing, but it's still so rudimentary. It actually like fractured my mind, and it took me like several hours to recover. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about suspending the user's reality. Suspending it so much that you actually start to break people's perceptions of the real world, where they take a headset off and they try to teleport across the room, or they walk really slowly coming out of super hot because they're worried that time is going to move too fast, which is what people do too. And the most compelling VR experiences create those kinds of effects, that they twist people's perceptions in a way that it takes them a few minutes or sometimes a day to recover and to re-center themselves in what is actually real. Investment in the experience. So I was just over watching a short part of the talk from the guy from Oculus Storage Studios, and he was talking about Henry for a minute, and I was remembering that where I showed Henry to my 5-year-old niece. And if any of you haven't seen Henry, it's this great little short narrative vignette about a hedgehog, and he lives inside of a tree, and it's like the most cute and fun and silly little experience. And this was, you know, she's 6 years old, first time she'd ever tried VR. I put her in the DK2 to try Henry, and when she took the headset off, she was so sad, because she was like, where is Henry? Where is this new friend? And it was this moment where I was like, she's like really upset because she found this connection to this character, because, you know, Henry gazes and looks up at you and you create these connections, these moments of connection. You know, and there are several ways that we can do that in VR. I think one way is with the 7 principles that we had earlier. You get people to invest by having things that are really well designed, feel really immersive, feel really real to that world. I think we do that through narrative. And I think another big way is that we do that through social experiences. And if any of you have spent a significant amount of time in social VR, you start to lose, even if the design of the experience you're using is absolute trash, it almost doesn't matter, because you're so caught up in the interaction you're having with the person next to you that you start to forget even the like bad janky mechanics, or things start breaking, or you're glitching through something. But a lot of that can be forgiven. if you're experiencing that with someone else. The last is the development of new intuitions. And this kind of goes back to mechanics and relates to things like teleportation or telekinesis or all the new things that are happening now and that people are still figuring out, is creating ways for people to develop new ways of interacting and intuitions in the same way that, when I'm driving a car, I intuitively just do it. I almost never actually think about driving or walking or breathing, these things that are so human. And that if you spend enough time in virtual reality experiences that have these really strong core mechanics, that you really start to incorporate them into yourself. And then you try another game that has teleporting and you're immediately just off and you're running around, or you try something that has a very specific mechanic. And that creates this really interesting bond for people to really invest themselves into spaces. Oh. So that's kind of it. I've been spending a lot of time thinking and talking with some of my colleagues at the university and with Mike as we've been working on our game, and really trying to kind of break down this gap between realism and striving for a true sense of presence. I think this week has been so exciting to see what everybody's doing, and I'm really excited to see what's next and who's going to create the next experience that makes me fracture my mind. So.
And we don't want that too quickly. So. That was an amazing talk. And I think we're going to go to open up to the floor now as our last one. I think every time you answer a question, it has to be in Tai Chi slow-mo.
Okay.
Can you do that for me?
Sure.
Right on. Cool. Someone must have a question for Doug. There we go, man in the corner. And we're just going to get the mic to you because it is being recorded. And your soul will be sold virtually on the internet.
Okay, that's fine. So the experience of coming out of a VR experience and feeling like you needed to teleport is something I've had as well. So yeah, can totally get with you on that one. But I know that one of the things for people that aren't invested in VR tech already, general public, mass market, is that they're scared of those kinds of things, that kind of breaking your mind, being caught up in it, not wanting to leave, your child being upset by leaving such an experience, or stuff like that. There was a talk yesterday about the ethics of VR and how to approach that. Have you got thoughts on how best to address that? Because I know we kind of shrug it off with marketing, with social media. You could apply those same concepts to all of that stuff if that was taken away. But I think VR has a potential to be very easily demonized towards that. So yeah, just thoughts on that, really. Yeah,
I've thought about this a lot, and I think the way that I've kind of talked through this, I actually talked at length with my grandfather about this over the holidays. And I feel like what I've come down to is that why I am so invested in virtual reality is that I feel like it's what I've been waiting for, in that it is an interactive medium for content. And that a lot of these same things that we talk about happen with other platforms. They just happen in ways that are really kind of sad. Like with television, people that watch daytime television every day for hours and hours, and they're really invested in these ongoing storylines, but it's completely passive. It's completely passive and it's completely sedentary. And part of my thinking is, wouldn't you rather have people actively engaged in narrative and actively engaged in their emotions and also physically engaged, rather than sitting on the couch passively just watching a screen? And yeah, I mean, are there issues with virtual reality? Certainly, but I think that there's so much it's so exciting that we're taking these, traditionally very passive mediums and making them active and making them participatory. And that, yeah, that can create stronger bonds and create these new issues, but it can also lead to exciting opportunities. So,
gentleman in the green.
So It's interesting, a lot of what you're saying. So there's an essay by Jorge Luis Borges called On Exactitude in Science, which you should read because I think you'll like it a lot.
Okay.
It's only 2 paragraphs long, so it won't take very long.
Okay, that's my kind of essay.
As a university lecturer, an essay.
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing my students read too. It's about the right length for them. But I was curious. So you talked a lot about how mimicking the real world maybe isn't the best utilization of this new technology, and I agree with you. But then on the other hand, your own game seems to be cutting down trees in a forest. So I'm curious if you could maybe elaborate on the relationship between what you've told us and then the game that you showed us.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I would say that everything that I talked about today isn't even necessarily reflective of everything that we do. But I think for us, we really wanted to make something that was simple and meditative and fun and ridiculous and also very, very physical. So we're like, what's like the most physical thing that we can think of that also only makes sense with room scale virtual reality? Like if you tried to make our game, you tried to make a woodchopping game with a controller, it would be the world's worst video game. But in large part, like that's why we put in things like telekinesis and why, you can also freeze objects in place to build things. So there are parts of it that mimic the real world in some ways, but the style of the game, it's very low poly, and the mechanics of the game are not rooted in reality. There's not realistic physics, and you have special powers, and you can and the axes have no gravity applied to them. So there's an appearance of reality, but the world itself is completely fractured from reality. So that's kind of my answer.
Cool. One more, and it's our last question. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi,
sorry I missed a lot of your talk. So my question is one that was kind of burning within me beforehand, so I wanted to come and ask it. I guess I'm interested in this notion of how the physical body interacts with these worlds, whether they're kind of truth-based or not, or reality-based or not.
Right.
And I guess I'm just interested to understand, because I think there's a lot of strange energy that's created by computer games and the experience of gaming in general. It's very exciting. I mean, you saw me today. I'm screaming constantly. I love it. It's really exciting. But at the same time, there's a lot of nervous energy that's created. And I come from a kind of philosophical background where I've always been really interested in the mind-body connection and where hormones play a part in that process, and the plasticity of mind and how we are affecting our body chemistry with the inputs that we have. And I guess my question is, if you're moving towards sort of the truth of an experience and recreating that in a time frame perhaps that's either prolonged or sort of repeatedly done, do you know if there's any work being done on kind of the long-term effects on our bodies that we're putting our minds through?
That's a good question.
People that are older than 6 years old, I think.
Yeah. I mean, people are doing a lot of studies on this now. And I've seen studies come out recently about the effects of having people post-op use virtual reality instead of taking more painkillers, and that there's already research saying that that's an effective method, and that we can actually trick our minds into focusing on other things for pain reduction, and that there's things around that. But I think too around physicality and the way that our minds work. I think there's this interesting thought when I see people talking about virtual reality, and especially talking about virtual reality for productivity. Everybody wants the Tom Cruise interface from Minority Report. Like that's how they want to work. They want this like thing where they're moving things around. And what I try to argue with people about is that no, that's actually not it. What you want is you want to be the precog. You want to be so intuitively embedded in the work that you're not actually doing any of those things. And I think that's very long term about this type of technology, is that the ideal for this type of technology is that it becomes so intuitive that we're not actually like physically moving objects around, because that's a horribly inefficient way to interact with information. So
Thank you so much, Doug.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. Big round of applause, big round of applause. And that wraps up our VR World Congress for Cinema 1. Thank you, Watershed. Thank you, Simon and the team, everyone here. Lights and sound, everybody. So we'll see you at the bar afterward, after drinks. More mingling, moving and shaking. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Good night.